Good evening and a warm welcome to another biography event. My name is Kai Bird, and I have the honor of serving as the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. And specifically, I want to thank her for her recent, rather incredible contribution of $10 million to our endowment fund. Plus another pledge of up to $5 million in matching grants. So if any of you have a little change to spare, the Leon Levy Foundation will match your grant up to an amount of $5 million. So, you give me $1 million, Shelby will match it. So think about it. You can talk to me after this event to get further details. Please note that this is our last event for the spring. We will resume in the autumn of 2024 and will announce our events at that time on our website. And if you have not done so already, please register your email address on our website so that you can be notified of our future events. But tonight I am delighted to welcome Nicholas Shakespeare to be in conversation with me about his terrific new biography, Ian Fleming, The Complete Man. Shakespeare grew up in the Far East and in South America, including Brazil, where his father worked in the British Embassy between 1966 and 69. Nicholas is the author of no less than 17 novels and biographies and works of nonfiction, an incredible output. In 1999, Shakespeare published his biography of Bruce Chatwin to widespread critical acclaim. This was followed by the novel Snowleg in 2004, longlisted for the Booker Prize. Shakespeare's novels, which have been translated into 22 languages, place ordinary people against a background of significant events, as with The Dancer Upstairs, which deals with Abimael Guzman, leader of Peru's Shining Path, and Snowleg, set partly during the Cold War in East Germany. All of this is to say that Nicholas has been quite prolific. I should say also that he is here tonight because we happened to run into each other last February at the Jaipur Literary Festival, and I was so charmed that I promised to interview him about his new biography of James Bond. I mean Ian Fleming. Nick and I will be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we'll take questions from our in-person audience. This event is being live streamed, so hello out there to all our virtual audience. We will try to end this program after about 1 hour, and again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for this and all our events. So now I will interrogate Mr. Shakespeare about Ian Fleming and James Bond. So, Nick, I have to say that this is probably one of the most salacious biographies I've read in many years. Almost every chapter has mistresses, affairs, and sex throughout. Do you plead guilty?
On his behalf, I think.
So why did you, a novelist, decide to take on the life of Ian Fleming?
Well, about 5 years ago, I was beginning a novel in a place I write in, a kind of GoldenEye equivalent in Tasmania. I have a 2-bedroom shack facing the South Pole. It's as far away from England as you can get. Any further, you're on your way home again. And suddenly I get a call from my agent in London saying we've been approached by the Fleming estate and they want to commission a new biography. There was one they commissioned in 1966 by John Pearson, a marvelous biography, but they feel a lot of material's come up since, and they'd be interested, that you would be interested in doing this. I have to confess, my first reaction was slight hesitation, because one of the morals, I feel, of the Ian Fleming story is don't run off with the wife of the owner of the Daily Mail if you wish to avoid forever after being rendered into tabloid fat, which is what had happened to him. This caricature image I had of Ian Fleming was of a kind of old Etonian bounder who hits the road after beating his wife, goes off to the golf club, comes back from his London club, goes up the stairs to his monastic bedroom past his rather bitchy wife who's invited all these intellectuals like Isaiah Berlin and Evelyn Waugh and Peter Cornell who wave him goodbye as he goes further up the stairs to bed and pulls the sheet over his head, trying to drown out the sniggers down below of these people reading out passages from the latest James Bond. That, I think, was the Daily Mail image I had of him. And so I thought, do I want to spend 3 or 4 years in the company of this bounder? And I was inclined to say no. And so I asked for 2 months to do some due diligence. And in those 2 months, I discovered 2 things which surprised me. One, he was much kinder than the image I had. All the women, and as you allude to, there were legions of them. Rebecca West says that the number of women who were in love with him would have filled the Albert Hall. And these women all remained in love with him after their affairs were over. They talked about him as a kind person. Again and again, the word kind came up in reference to Ian Fleming. His mistress during the Second World War, Maud Russell, a very distinguished woman, who in fact bought him Goldeneye after the war for £2,000, where he wrote all the James Bond books. I found an unpublished diary she wrote 7 years after he dies, and she says, I think of Ian constantly, and I think above all of his kindliness. Well, kindliness is a very sexy quality for a biographer to find, especially when it goes against the grain of what you imagine the author of Ian Fleming to be, of James Bond to be. The second, and this was also his male friends, who were slightly less interesting. They were kind of old Etonians, duffers, who he would play golf with and play bridge with, but he was loyal to them for the rest of his life. And they all thought of him as a very kind, loyal person, rather a quality that was at odds with a cad. Secondly, he was much more important than I had hitherto expected. My esteemed editor on the Daily Telegraph, Max Hastings, wonderful military historian, can't quite be shifted from his image of Ian Fleming as a kind of chocolate sailor in the war who was just in charge of in-trays, out-trays, and ashtrays. So during the 6 years he was in Naval Intelligence as a commander, the image again arose that he was a rather unimportant desk job man who kind of invented the fact he'd been a bit more important.
But he was one of the few people who had access to Ultra.
He was exactly what, so my first discovery was that he was one of 30 people who were Ultra cleared, along with his brother Peter. 30 people in England, you know, all Churchill's. Desmond Morton, who was in charge of Churchill's intelligence, didn't get Ultra clearance. I mean, this is a very, very important access to the inner citadel of British intelligence. The 2 other writers, I never knew Fleming. He died in 1964, age 56, but I knew Graham Greene and I knew John le Carré, both of whom had been in British intelligence and made a mountain of their work in British intelligence, but both were incredibly minor operatives. I mean, Graham Greene was counting condoms in Sierra Leone during the war, and John le Carré was in Hamburg, and I don't think he had a successful operation in his minor role in British intelligence, but you know, you would never know that from his creation of Smiley, wonderful creation, but he wasn't very important. Fleming was absolutely the Kippers Knickers of British intelligence. He was a naval commander, but he had access to every single pie. And so as the war starts, and we don't really have a kind of proper intelligence system, naval intelligence becomes the leading kind of branch of British intelligence. And also, it's the Navy who are in operation from day one. The Army and the Air Force aren't in operation until the phony war ends about 6 months later in April. But Fleming is also important in creating a band of commandos, the Fleming 30 AU, which was to go into fields of battle ahead of the troops and to capture all the Enigma machines and code books, which would be sent back to Bletchley.
So he actually was deeply involved in covert actions.
In every aspect, I mean, not just in one aspect, but in all the different covert.
The interceptive intelligence, the technology.
Propaganda. He set up with Seft and Delmer the propaganda unit, and because he spoke fluent German, he would himself do broadcasts to Germany, pretending to be, he would give them kind of wonderful stories like, don't come across the channel because we've imported sharks from Australia that will eat you all, or all kind of, fake news, I suppose, in an early...
Operation Mincemeat.
He suggested that in the early days, and that became a famous... I think some of his more important operations are less sexy. They're kind of trying to buy the Spanish to kind of not allow the Germans to use the boat. So he's using his banking connections. I mean, often in intelligence, it's banking that helps to finance these operations.
He had worked as a banker.
Worked as a banker, and his grandfather had founded Fleming's Bank and had become one of the wealthiest people.
He was really quite wealthy.
Not himself.
But
again,
the family
was
growing up and his access to wealth is such.
Exactly. He knew his grandfather had known the Morgans, had come over to America to fund the railroads with Scottish jute money. So he was in touch with all these people. I think he didn't have the wealth that everyone thought he had, and that's why he ended up writing James Bond, hoping he was going to get rich. But the most, for American audience, his most important intelligence work was in April 1941, before America comes into the war. He comes out to Washington and New York to try and persuade America to create a foreign intelligence service. It's incredible to think you didn't have a foreign intelligence service in 1941, and you haven't come into the war. So he and William Stevenson, who is the quiet Canadian, a man called Intrepid, Little Bill, who was in charge of British intelligence in New York and Washington. They work on William Donovan, Colonel William Donovan, Wild Bill, to create an American intelligence service which Roosevelt kind of greenlights. And so Fleming works with Donovan April, May, June 1941 in Georgetown in various houses, giving him the blueprint based on naval intelligence, which Donovan then gets greenlit, and this becomes the COI that summer, it becomes the OSS the following year, and it becomes the CIA in 1947. And many of Fleming's friends later on, like Alan Dulles, he knew all the heads of the CIA, but from the beginning. I think that was surprising to me. So when Churchill talks of the special relationship, which is really an intelligence relationship, Fleming is one of the 2 or 3 people in the room and sometimes in the bedroom when all these important decisions were being made.
Yeah, it's really just astonishing. I came to this book thinking, oh, Ian Fleming, he's the author of these James Bond fantasies. But on page 446, you write, a perception of Ian's novels that he did much to popularize is that they were a series of sensational fantasies based on the most hopeless-sounding plots. But then you say this was not the case.
No, and I mean, as the war comes to an end, he is contributing to the Bland Report, which was, and his brother, which is the future of British intelligence. I mean, he's one of the people predicting cyber warfare. He's predicting drones in his report. And in 1945, as the war comes to an end, he's chairing JIC meetings, which is phenomenally important. I mean, he's chairing Joint Intelligence Bureau meetings about the future service, what it will take. He's then offered a job in it. And he thinks about, should I take this job? And it's clear that had he accepted it, he'd become eventually head of SIS, MI6, a few years later. He decides not to. He decides to become a journalist, go back to his journalist. He was in Reuters, and he always wanted to kind of have a Reuters operation. And so he's offered the possibility on the Sunday Times of running about 88 foreign correspondents around the world, many of whom were intelligence people. So I think he thinks of this in the Cold War, which the new enemy is Russia. So when that doesn't work after about 5 years, and his pregnant girlfriend is, a child is about to come, marriage is about to come. He escapes into his bachelor self, and he recreates his bachelor existence, and he bases it, I think, on the person he might have been had he stayed on in British intelligence and after in the Cold War. And he takes all these operations that he had and shelved against the Germans from 40 to 46, and he recasts them against the Russians. And so I think very much he is, in Bond, he is himself using Nazi operations disguised as against the Russians. And every single Bond villain, apart from, I think, the Spang brothers, has a Russian kind of controller.
So Fleming is Bond.
I think more than not, I think.
And, you know, there's a sense also that what he did during the war was so exciting, was so important. When it ended, his life, his interesting life was over. And so it was a letdown, right? And so he drifts into eventually writing these books for money, but also because it was a way to relive what he had done during World War II. So he goes off to Jamaica, and who is it who buys
Maud Russell, this woman he'd been having an affair with in the war.
And explain their relationship. I mean, she seems to be not just a mistress, but a guiding mentor.
She was married to a man called Gilbert Russell, and she was a Jewish, very rich art collector, lived in a beautiful house in the English countryside. And she knew all these people like Lord Vansittart, like Harold Nicholson. So at these weekends, you would have all these quite important English politicians there. And young Fleming would bump into these people. So I think the mystery of how did this playboy stockbroker, she got him a job in stockbroking earlier, how did he end up in British intelligence? I think it's because he was meeting all these big swinging dicks in British intelligence at her house at weekends. And she loved him, and her diaries are wonderful. The edition of her war diaries, and she's a trustworthy witness, and so that was rather nice to
she just buys him this
buys him his lovely house.
How much?
But it only cost £2,000. Well,
£2,000,
yes,
which
yes.
was a lot of
Quite
money.
a lot of money then, but not as much. I mean, tonight to spend in GoldenEye, it's $8,000 a night. Yes.
So, this is a biography, but it's a biography that provides you just a very colorful window into British ruling class society and how power works in England in the 30s and 40s and afterwards. And so you learn a lot of history along the way. I think that's sort of the power of biography. But let's get back to the man a little bit. You mentioned earlier that all his women still loved him even after the affairs ended. But he had his enemies. The painter Lucian Freud said of Fleming, he was and then he used the C word, ghastly, phony, depressing, snobbish.
And I think that's the image I had of him. And so it was slightly the opposite of the trajectory I had with Bruce Chatwin, who I'd written, the only other biography I've written, who was an English travel writer, slightly forgotten now, but I knew him at the end of his life and really adored he kind of was, when he came into a room, it was so exciting. He just shone light and humor on everything. And I got to know him, and so when I did the biography, it was slightly a different trajectory. After 7 years, which is the kind of length of transportation for convicts to Australia, I felt rather shattered. And I think the problem of biography is you have an unfair forensic lens and intimacy on somebody. I mean, I knew more about Bruce Chatwin than his wife did at the end, and I kind of didn't like him so much, and it took quite a long time afterwards to retrieve my friendship with him, even though he'd been dead for many years. So you have the opposite with Fleming. I felt Fleming was a kind of, as I said, a rather unappetizing bounder like Lucian Freud says. And at the end, I felt he was quite a sympathetic figure and much more interesting and substantial than I had hitherto anticipated. I had early on, I got hold of, he had a dreadful mother, which is one of the problems, and he ended up marrying a kind of mother figure who was also fairly dreadful. And the mother dictated where he spent his holidays, what profession he should have, and his girlfriends. And so when he's about 21, he gets engaged to a Swiss girl because he's gone off to Monique. He's gone off to, I mean, another thing I hadn't realized about Fleming is he's quite a Central European intellectual. I mean, age 20, he's invited to translate All Quiet on the Western Front. I mean, he nearly does it, and then he gets the gig and doesn't. But he translates Carl Jung, a kind of Carl Jung essay. He translates Thomas Mann. This is not the Fleming I had the idea of, and he's also a big book collector. I mean, his collection of first editions in the 30s was one of the most important private collections, and it's now in Bloomington Library in Indiana. That's not the Fleming. James Bond reads 3 books in the entire series. I think he reads A Guide to Golf and JFK's Profiles in Courage, and he doesn't even finish them. I think he's just seen with the books, he never reads them. Fleming is a reader and speaks many languages, and I think that was a surprise.
But he falls in love with Monique, and they're engaged for 3 years, and then he allows his mother to just sabotage it and force
the mother says she'll withdraw all his money, no allowance, and she almost leaves because she comes to see the mother and everything, and he presents his fiancée, and the mother kind of refuses to have a fire in her bedroom, and then finds them in bed together and kind of is very upset. So Monique goes back to Switzerland. Monique then marries, eventually, the man who invents Velcro. And, and they have a son called Charles. And I got hold of Charles finally, and he lives in the house where Monique was. And he said Monique held a candle for Fleming for the rest of her life and had this little shrine of pictures that Fleming had given her. And he sends me these pictures, the original photographs. And so I had those on my desk for 4 years. So I look across the desk the whole time at this man, with his bow tie and his cigarette, looking at me. And I look at him, and I just feel he just defies me to penetrate him. And I think, you are a kind of son of a bitch. I don't like you at all. Right at the end, I look across, and I feel I do quite like him. It was a very strange moment, but it was a wonderful talismanic thing to have the very pictures he had given these pictures to her, and they'd been in.
He's very sympathetic at the end because he struggles so hard as a writer. He's rather shy. Mm-hmm. He doesn't like going to the cocktail parties that his wife is trying to organize for him. He's trying to desperately write these books. And go snorkeling, a nice combination. And you sort of begin to sympathize with his struggle as a writer. Those first 6 Bond novels, they sold no more than 10,000 copies.
I think in America they sold 4,000, and he's going to kill Bond off because after 5 books, I think Raymond Chandler says, "Come on, you can do better than that. You're a better writer than this." And so he puts a real effort into it and writes From Russia with Love, and then decides that's going to be his last one. At the end of Russia with Love, I think Irma Klebb is going to kill him or poison him with poison toe caps, and he tells his publisher, "I'm going off to Jamaica, I think that's going to be my last Bond." And then something extraordinary happens. The Suez crisis happens, and Anthony Eden, another old Etonian, I mean, this book is full of old Etonians who were at school with him, and Eden's wife is the godmother of Fleming's child. He invades Suez catastrophically and has a kind of mental breakdown and decides that he needs to recuperate during the crisis. And where does he choose to recuperate? But in Goldeneye, the place where all these Bond books was written.
In Jamaica.
In Jamaica. And again, an indication of how central Fleming and his wife were to British society, as you've alluded, is that the very day Fleming is arranging with the Prime Minister to go to his bedroom, it's a 2-bedroom house with no windows, the birds fly in and out. He hasn't quite told the Prime Minister this. There's no telephone.
It's sort of camping out.
Complete camping out. But he's been so lavish about how wonderful Goldeneye is, they all think it's rather more grand. Somebody says, Noel Carr said, he makes it sound like Noel, which is 365 bedrooms in Kent. It's very primitive. So while he's arranging for Eden to go and stay in his bedroom there, his wife, Anne, is in bed with the leader of the opposition in the Hotel Mirabeau in Paris. Betrayed. But I mean, they're at the epicenter of British society. Anyway, Eden goes out. He's going mad. He's like a Bond villain. From the gazebo in Goldeneye on these two telephones, he's sending directions and telexes to Cairo all around the world. And what happens is that Eden even goes into a dinghy that Fleming's left for him, and the dinghy sinks as he's paddling around.
Metaphorically.
No, but it sinks in the bay. Metaphorically, out of that same water comes James Bond, because the whole world's attention is on Goldeneye. Max Beaverbrook, the owner of the Daily Express, has a house in Jamaica and decides to serialize the next Bond book, which is from Russia with Love. And so suddenly you go from 4,000 copies to 20,000 copies. And suddenly, Fleming has to continue
feeding.
He can't kill off Bond. Now, what then happens to take Bond into the stratosphere is JFK. Now, this was the chapter I just totally...
Dinner with JFK in Georgetown.
I mean, this is... Can I tell the story? Because, I mean, this is like... So it's March 1960. Fleming's come back with Thunderball in his briefcase, and he goes down to see his friend Otzi Leiter in Georgetown. And she drives him through Georgetown, and suddenly they see the Kennedys leaving Holy Trinity Church, and she honks her white Chrysler, and Kennedy leans...
This is before...
that year he's going to be elected in November.
He's about to run for president.
About to run for president. And he leans in through the window and says, I've been trying to get hold of you because I've got Ian Fleming here and I wanted to bring him to dinner tonight. And Kennedy leans into the room and said, not the Ian Fleming, bring him to dinner tonight. Now, Otzi had given Kennedy, for the last 4 years, every year, she'd given him a Bond book, because he had backache in 1953. He said, Otzi, do you have any books? And she said, yeah, I'm going to send you some of these books. And he loved all these Bond books. And Otzi said he saw himself as Bond, this individual who could change a nation's, fortunes. They were both, so they turn up at dinner. I spoke to Otzi's daughter about what she was wearing that night and everything. And the house is Otzi's old house in Georgetown. Only 6 people at dinner. John Bross, who's another CIA and Bond fan. Joe Alsop, the famous columnist. And Jackie. And after dinner, Kennedy goes into the drawing room and turns to Fleming and says, what would James Bond do about Castro? And
he's getting advice from
getting advice. Now, what everyone thinks
an
is
active intelligence officer, maybe.
Exactly. So I think what the story has been slightly kind of just run. It's a kind of jokey thing people think, but no. Kennedy is really asking, what would Ian Fleming do about Castro? But he knows that Fleming was in Naval Intelligence, like he himself was.
Also, met during the war.
They'd met in 1939. Kennedy's father, Joseph, ambassador to London, 1939. The embassy is in Grosvenor Square on the site of Fleming's grandfather's house. So they had already kind of weird connections. In Fleming's notebook, I discover, in Fleming's handwriting, Cherry Devlin address. Cherry Devlin was married to Kennedy apparently in the late 1930s after a drunken party, and Joe Kennedy managed to get the marriage expunged. So it was possible they even sharing the same women. So they get on like a house on fire that night, and Fleming takes off and tells him what he would do about Castro. Many of the stories he tells him, we don't know quite, because the Warren Committee, or Church Committee, whatever it was, investigated afterwards, we can't get access to it. But some of the things Otzi reported clearly show that Fleming is telling Kennedy some of the stories that he and Donovan suggested for the OSS, operations like land a submarine and put a cross in the sky and announce that Castro has died and the second comings happened. Okay, because it's a very Catholic country.
Psychological
warfare. Or you've got to ridicule Castro. You've got to drop lavatory paper with his face on it. You've got to drop false currency pesos, so there'll be a run on the currency. All these are things that he had developed in the Second World War against the Japanese and against the Germans. They're just adaptations of that for a Cold War setting. I mean, some of the things later on, which I don't know if Fleming discussed that night, but they're like suggesting that they have an exploding seashell, because Castro, like Fleming, was known to be a
And
great
this came
diver.
out in the church committee
This came out in the
hearings.
church committee hearings.
He actually tried this.
That there would be an exploding shell, but also you'd have a scuba wear which would poison him, you know. Anyway, whatever happens that night, Kennedy's bewitched. I mean, he just, and Goetze later says he's in the presence of a kind of Hollywood actor. And Kennedy that night tries to get hold of Allen Dulles in New York, I think he was, because that morning he said, you've got to get hold of Ian. He's got these amazing kind of ideas for what to do with Castro. One of them was to, because of Castro's barbudos, all the bearded men, it was to suggest that leaflets would drop saying that the Americans had been conducting nuclear experiments which would result in all the beards falling off. Anyway, Kennedy's obsessed with these ideas, tells Dulles he's got to speak to Ian, Dulles is another Bond fan. We don't know if they did meet, but what happens then is that the Bay of Pigs, once President Kennedy comes into inauguration the following year.
So are you saying that Fleming is
wait,
responsible for the Bay of Pigs?
Everything about the Bay of Pigs is done in a James Bond paradigm. Bobby Kennedy says to William Tucker, who's in charge of the task force, you're no James Bond. When it goes wrong, Bobby Kennedy says, this wouldn't have happened to 007. I mean, no, it's extraordinary how they have framed the Bay of Pigs in it's like a disastrous James Bond thing. It's not only Kennedy who's obsessed, Bobby and JFK, and Eunice, I think, was also obsessed with these Bond books. It's also the person who kills JFK. Cut forward 2 years, November.
Say that again?
The person who kills JFK is also obsessed with James Bond.
Lee Harvey Oswald.
Lee Harvey Oswald. Cut forward to 1963 November, there's going to be a showing in the White House, private viewing of From Russia with Love, the second Bond film, which features an assassin called Donovan. Prime smear assassin. And it's a kind of nod to Donovan, William Donovan, with whom Fleming had worked in the war. And Kennedy can't be there that night, but several of the people who were at the dinner party 2 years earlier are at that showing. Kennedy's in Dallas. When the FBI burst into Lee Harvey Oswald's room, they find 4 James Bond novels, including From Russia with Love. It's been revealed recently that Lee Harvey Oswald called himself James as a pseudonym that summer. I mean, obsessed by James Bond. He saw himself as a kind of successful assassin, like Donovan.
Fleming actually caused not only the Bay of Pigs, but also Kennedy's assassination.
We have to be very speculative here, Kai.
All right.
But what's rather fascinating is you see all these, you see how Bond is very, very, takes root in people's imagination round about this time. And one reason why it kind of takes off is that Kennedy in 1961 is asked for his favorite books for Life magazine, and he includes From Russia with Love. So suddenly that goes to 13 million readers, and suddenly filmmakers become interested.
So from selling less than 10,000 copies,
you go to,
suddenly in 61,
you're selling 1 million or something,
million.
yeah. And suddenly filmmakers are interested, which is when Dr. No and then From Russia with Love become made. So I think it's, you know, going from gold, the boat sinking under Eden in GoldenEye to the films. I mean, it's almost as if James Bond is a one-man Suez. He's kind of representing the British Empire. While the sun sets on the British Empire, the glow on James Bond becomes more and more radiant as a kind of one-man savior.
So we got to move along to the tragedy of the end of his life. You know, he only is a writer the last 12 years of his life, really, writing the Bond books. And they're not successful until 61. And then he becomes a global celebrity, a literary star. He's compared, his popularity in 1963 is compared to the Beatles. His image is recognizable, Bond is, and yet he gets caught up in a terrible plagiarism trial, sued by one of his own, a friend who he has recruited to try to make, which one, Thunderball? And so tell that story. It's a really sad.
It's a tragedy. I mean, I spoke to Algy Clough. There's not that many people are alive who remember him, but Algy Clough was a young officer sitting next to him at Boodle's and said, gosh, you must love all this publicity. And, there are crowds weaving around Leicester Square, queuing to get into From Russia with Love, and he's selling something like 20 million books in these last 2 years. And Fleming says, no, it's not what I want at all. And Algy Clough says, what is it you'd like? And Fleming says, I'd like to be the captain of the Royal St. George's Golf Club. That's what I'd really like to be. And he meant it in a way, because I think he had no unhealthy...
He loved golf, right?
He loved golf, and I don't think he had any unhealthy estimation of his own literary worth. I mean, I think he wanted to be, he really envied Evelyn Waugh and Graham Greene, but he knew he wasn't in that category, even though they were friends of his. And he wrote these books in 8 weeks. He never spent more on them. And they were very, they did what he wanted them to do.
James Bond was no George Smiley. Huh?
James Bond was no George Smiley. And I challenged Le Carre on this. I said, you invented George Smiley in opposition to James Bond. Smiley is everything Bond's not. He's ugly, he's middle-aged, he's cuckolded, he's an intellectual, he's morally torn. And then you keep pinching people like Pierce Brosnan or Sean Connery for your books. You pinch Paul Dane, who wrote the screenplay for Goldfinger to do Spy Who Came from the Cold, and now you just told me you finished an adaptation of The Spy Who Came from the Cold, and you want none other than Daniel Craig to play the part. So don't tell me you're not influenced by James Bond. But even in opposition to it, I mean, Le Carre is a much greater writer, in my opinion, and in most people's opinions. But I can't remember what the answer to your question was about the tragedy, the plagiarism. So just as he's getting success. An Irish director called Kevin McClory, who has who doesn't read books, wanted to make a film and was told that these Bond franchises are rather good, and says, I don't really want to read them, but let's invent a plot. And so they all sit around a table and come up with an idea with Thunderball, all about an atomic bombs being hijacked and under the sea, and they all put their halfpence worth into the plot. And I think one of the difficulties, I've worked on one film and know that you just beg for good ideas to go into the mix, and you don't know who's put them in. You don't. I mean, actors can sometimes on set invent lines that go in, but they don't get credits for those lines. But so it's whatever goes in and makes it work. Anyway. All this went into the mix. The book then comes, he's begged to write the book on the basis of the plot they've done to help kind of get the film off the ground. So he does this, and then suddenly he falls out with the director. He doesn't acknowledge fatally the director in the book, and the director sues the pants off him. And so it goes to the High Court, where he has his first heart attack, because he's being accused of plagiarizing his own character. In the highest court in the land. It's a nightmare. And he suffers a heart attack 2 weeks after that. And I think his last 2 years are really awful. And a man, his old friend, Selby Armitage, meets him and says, you must love all your names in lights. You must love all the success. He says, ashes, dear boy, it's just ashes.
So one more question, then we'll open it up to the audience. A final tragedy. After he dies in 1964, tell the story of what Anne does with a lost, suddenly discovered manuscript, his last book, apparently.
So I spoke to one of the tragedies is that he has one son who's bipolar. We didn't know, I mean, as we now know, probably Fleming. It's a hereditary illness, and I suspect I was careful about saying this, but I think there's probably evidence that Fleming may have been too.
On the spectrum.
On the spectrum. It accounts for so many of the contradictions in his character. And it's a bit like Bruce Chapman, almost anything you can say of him, the opposite is true too. So, and as somebody said of Bruce Chapman, he wasn't one person, he was a scrum of people. And I think Fleming's very much like that, all competing with each other. And so he was never the same person 2 hours later to many of his friends, which would, I think that element would have explained it in his son. And the son commits suicide. Age 25, yes, in 1973. And what happens then, one of the great friends of the son, a man called Thomas Hennish, who's a very eminent art dealer, books of art, and has an art bookshop in London and a bibliographer. He's asked by Anne Fleming, Fleming's widow and Casper's mother, to go through Casper's trunk upstairs in Sevenhampton. So he goes upstairs, he opens the trunk, and there is the penciled manuscript of Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which he had written for Casper and given to Casper. And then under it, he finds this wodge, 3/4 thick, of typewritten manuscript. And he starts reading it, and he realizes this is a new Bond novel. It's never, he could see the film coming out of it. And he takes it downstairs to Anne Fleming, who's sitting on the sofa by the fire. He says, "Look what I found." And he hands it to her, and she looks at it, and she says, "Oh, one of Ian's boobies." And she throws it into the fire.
Oh.
And Thomas Henry says he just looked at this flames, flabbergasted. He couldn't kind of explain it at all. And that suggests also the relationship between Anne Fleming, who didn't want him to dedicate Casino Royale to her because it was too sadistic, and it's not the kind of book you dedicate to people. It suggests her kind of influence on him and their son.
He was a very unlucky soul.
Yes, and I think I'll end where I began in the book, which is to discover that he dies on the golf course on the day that he wants to give his son's birthday. He wants to give him the facts of life, age 12, and he dies. And 3 days later is the funeral at the church of St. James's, appositely named, on the edge of their estate near Swindon, Sevenhampton. And you have to remember, this man is now fantastically famous in a way that no English writer's been. I mean, probably Byron or something, but I mean, we are talking about millions of copies being sold, films coming out, at the level of fame we are not used to in England. And at the church, only 14 people come to the funeral, his family, but very few members of the family. And so I tracked down the last survivors of that congregation, and they both tell me something I just found astonishing. They said, "Yeah, we were there, and my eyes came out like organ stops." I said, "Well, what happened?" She said, "Well, at 2:00, we were all assembled, 14 of us. It was rather cold. There were some lamps there for the heat, and the vicar, Edward Darnley, gets up to begin the service, and he sees a woman weeping in the front row in black, and he thinks it's the widow. He thinks it's Anne Fleming. So he starts the service. And we're looking around because she hasn't arrived. She's bringing Ian's coffin along the banks of the lake, and she's late. She was always late. The vicar doesn't know who she is, so he thinks it's the sister-in-law is the widow. They get up. The service starts for 5 minutes, and then suddenly, this kind of looks around, and in the back of the church has come Anne Fleming with the coffin. The service has to start all over again. That, to me, as a novelist, was fabulous, because I felt, you all think you know Ian Fleming? I'm going to turn the soil. I'm going to begin again. I'm going to take you back to the beginning. I want us to start again with this person.
Okay, on that note, let's open it up to discussion, questions.
Did Fleming ever question or have any doubts about the cause he was serving?
So did Fleming have doubts about the cause he was serving?
Yes.
I don't think so at all. I think it was absolutely clear. Although he loved Germany and spoke German, I think he never had doubts that that it was black and white during the war. And I think against communism too. Yes, I think when he goes to Russia in 1933 to cover a show trial for Reuters, and he sees at first hand this amazing judge, Wyszynski, who becomes foreign minister at one point, I think. And, you know, this man is just destroying these 6 English electrical engineers from Metrovica. It's a Putin-esque trial. I mean, it's absolutely Putin, manufactured evidence. So I think he sees the danger of Russia in 1933, and he warns that after the war, Russia is going to descend carrion-like on the battlefields of Europe, and I think he was accurate in that. I don't think he ever, and he always thought of America as you know, the ally. I mean, he had problems with America and American kind of values sometimes, but he never doubted that they were on his side and he was on their side. I don't think he was a man plagued by that kind of doubt.
Did Ian Fleming have any input, or what was his opinion about the Bond movie? I think there was only one produced before he died, Dr. No?
2. I mean, he saw Dr. No and From Russia with Love. I think initially he wanted somebody like James Mason or Cary Grant. I mean, lots of people were approached to be Bond, and none of them wanted to do it. I mean, this wasn't a particularly important thing for these actors, and I think the Broccoli's wanted somebody who they could have to do several of a series, and none of these actors wanted to commit to more than one. So several, I think something like 30 people were tried, I mean, including Dirk Bogarde and James Fox, and a woman, Susan Hayward, was considered, which is rather interesting. And they then decided to have to have an unknown, because it would cost them much less. And Connery was kind of selected, and there was a woman who's still alive called, I'll get her name in a minute. She was a great friend of she was the cousin of Ivor Bryce, who was had been funding some of the proposals, and Fleming invites her to the Savoy for lunch to meet Connery to see what she thinks of him. And she'd seen a lot of his other possibilities. Anyway, she thinks Connery is fantastic and tells Ian when in the car afterwards, that man has it, and none of the others have. He could murder somebody and you'd still find him attractive. And so I think when Fleming then sees him in the Rough Cut, he then recognizes how good he is. I think he'd been a bit ambivalent until he sees him, because he kind of thought he wanted a kind of upper-class Englishman, and Connery wasn't that. But when he sees him on screen, he thinks... I spoke to Chris Black.
He didn't like his accent.
He didn't like his accent, but he presumably spoke in a Scottish accent until then. But there's an amazing moment. Chris Blackwell, who now owns GoldenEye, was a gopher on the set of Dr. No, age 17, and he told me that it's a kind of B movie, it's not going to make any money, and they then look at the rushes for the scene when Ursula Andress comes out of the sea in her bikini, and Fleming and Connery is singing Under the Mango Tree. Anyway, they see the rushes that night, and they just know they've got a movie, and they ring London and say, we need some more money for the... I mean, one of the exciting things about that film is that the music, the famous Bond theme tune, which I think Kai had playing earlier on, that comes, Monty Norman, I spoke to him just before he died, he said that he'd been asked to do a musical for V.S. Naipaul's novel, The House for Mr. Biswas, for Peter Brook. They wanted to put it on Broadway. And in the end, he does a few sample songs, but they can't raise the money, and he puts them in the drawer, and then suddenly he's asked to come and do this music for Dr. No, and he goes out and he does two of these Under the Mango Tree, and then he's asked to do the theme tune. So he brings out some of the rejects for House for Mr. Biswas, and on his piano in London, he starts to kind of tinkle away, and suddenly he cuts the opening cadenza or whatever in half, and he realized, and it was all for sitar music, this was, and he suddenly realized this is much smokier and more sexy than that. And they get John Barry, I think, to orchestrate it. And that becomes 25 films on, that's still, but I love the idea it's based on a V.S. Naipaul reject. And I think Naipaul became slightly obsessed with the fame of Fleming, and he goes to see Thunderball open in Kampala in Uganda, and the president is turning up, and Naipaul doesn't realize that when he's watching the theme tune, it's based on something he wrote.
The ironies.
Yes.
Who was the woman in black sobbing in the front row at the funeral?
It was his sister-in-law, married to his brother. Richard Fleming was his younger brother, and I think she was called Charmian.
And the intensity of her grief was just as the sister-in-law?
Well, I wasn't there, but I'm trying to get into the head of the vicar. I imagine whether she was weeping or not, he took her as the widow. But clearly she was doing a good imitation of somebody in mourning.
Other questions?
What would you attribute the source of his success as an intelligence officer?
Well, the odd thing is he never revealed anything. Even his boss, Admiral Godfrey, didn't realize that Fleming was a great friend of Godfrey's great friend. So I think he had an immense discretion, which you wouldn't necessarily associate with him, because I'm sure he was quite a good gossip and everything. And I think this discretion led people to think, oh, he invented all these Bond books stuff he did, because he could never talk about what he'd done in the war. I mean, none of these characters talk. They've all signed the Official Secrets Act, but it's beyond that. They don't talk. And so I think that discretion was pretty impressive.
But Nick, I noticed in the book that you mentioned that Fleming's own SIS folder from his intelligence days is still classified.
Well, if it exists, I don't even know.
You don't even know if
it don't exist.
It must exist.
Of course, but how do I find out? I mean, that's what's frustrating.
But you at the Public Records Office, you have a automatic 30-year rule or something, no?
Okay. My father, who was a diplomat and who worked for Frank Giles, who then became Fleming's successor on the Sunday Times, after he retired, became a sensitivity officer, which I love the title. I'd love to have called a novel that. His job was to sift through the stuff coming up to the 30-year rule to see if it should be released on basis on kind of would it cause embarrassment or pain? But I mean, that's a pretty wide. And he would decide, we won't release that. So no, I think all that's pretty porous. And the difficulty about the National Archives is that you must find this, so often it's been wrongly catalogued. So you might look in a box and it's not there, or you might find something which you weren't expecting in another box. So I could spend the rest of my life looking for Fleming material, and I'm sure I'd find some, but a lot of it's been discovered, whatever's in the archives. But I don't think there's an enormous amount to come out. And the problem is the SAS aren't going to tell you if there's a file or not.
So what new sources did you have? I mean, you have an enormous amount of detail from his private life. There were diaries of these women. There were letters that hadn't been seen before. What was the best thing that you found?
Well, the family kind of said, we will give you material that hasn't been seen, but that was mainly photographs and early letters from his childhood. But again, fascinating early letters, because I think so much of his later life is in the formation in this unhappy childhood with a father who dies when he's 8. And I was lucky. I mean, there's so many bits and pieces come out accidentally that people aren't aware, and you suddenly see in a biography of Millicent Rogers, for instance, a woman he had an affair with the Standard Oil heiress, but that biographer had letters from Millicent Rogers to Fleming and Fleming to her that she quotes, and that you wouldn't normally necessarily expect to find it in that. I mean, you have to look at every biography of all the people he knew to kind of amass bits and pieces. I think the biggest luck was the Maud Russell diaries that had been published only for the wartime, and the granddaughter had them in Chile, and I spent a year trying to persuade her to let me see the unpublished years afterwards, and she finally did. So this revealed something extraordinary, which I think is still the reason why the Daily Mail hasn't reviewed the book. And this I think was the most extraordinary revelation I found, is that, Fleming is having an affair in the war with Anne O'Neill, who was married to his friend Shane O'Neill, Lord O'Neill, who he was at school with. And she's also having an affair with Esmond Rothermere, who owns the Daily Mail. And they're all playing bridge together twice a week, you know, these people. O'Neill is killed in Italy, so she's now free to marry. She wants Fleming to propose to her, but he doesn't. He's a kind of absolutely confirmed bachelor. So she marries Lord Rothermere, the owner of the Daily Mail. This is in 1945. Within a few months, Fleming has decided that he actually does love her after all. So they start an affair. And she goes as a kind of chaperone with the Duchess of Westminster, Lelia Duchess of Westminster, who was having an affair with William Donovan before the war. I mean, you know, all this was riveting. I discovered I don't think the American scholars have known that Donovan comes over to England, not to save England, but to have an affair with the Duchess of Westminster. I mean, that's... So they go to Goldeneye in 1947, Lelia and Anne Rothermere, to visit their friend Ian. And Rothermere knows that Ian's a great friend for the war. Anyway, they sleep together, and Anne Rothermere gets pregnant. Rothermere is thrilled, because he doesn't think his children by his earlier marriage are his children. He thinks the wife was having an affair with the Aga Khan, etc. So he's thrilled now to have a child with Anne Rothermere. And he says to her, if it's a boy, I'm going to leave the Daily Mail to this child. Okay, this is all in Maud Russell's diaries, because Anne... And so you have the idea that, my goodness, Fleming always wanted to be a newspaper magnate, and he's going to have a child who's going to inherit the Daily Mail. What happens that summer? So she comes back, heavily pregnant. Rothermere's thrilled. He then invites Fleming, Lelia Westminster, and his pregnant wife up to Glen Eagles for the birth. So the four of them, they're playing golf, and suddenly the waters break. She's rushed to hospital in Edinburgh, and Lelia's waiting with Ian. Lelia doesn't know that this baby's Ian's. Only Ian and Anne know this. Ian is kind of saying, my God, my baby's there. And anyway, Rothermere rings up and says, we've had a girl's just been born, and 8 hours later the girl dies. About a week later, Lelia tells Rothermere that it wasn't his baby. And then you have kind of turmoil and divorce and everything. But I thought that was absolutely gripping, to that moment at which a James Bond baby might have become the owner of the Daily Mail.
It's incredible.
Can I ask you, what was his relationship to John le Carré, David Cornwell?
None at all. They never met.
They never met?
No. Fleming was quite generous about the spy who came in from the cold. And then I gave a presentation with le Carré. It was at the German embassy a few months before he died. It was kind of the last public outing he did before COVID took root about 2 days later. And during the course of this, I asked David, my parents were friends of David Cornwell, so I'd known him for many years and had written 5 of my books in his cottage he lent me in Cornwall. But I suddenly found these strange links with le Carré and Fleming. Le Carré famously told people that he got the pseudonym le Carré. He tells different stories every time, but the one he told me is that he saw the name on the top of a double-decker bus on the Tottenham Court Road. He saw this le Carré, a kind of shop front, that he chose this name. And this is 10 years after Casino Royale comes out with Le Chiffre. Remember, the kind of Le Chiffre means the cipher, the baddie. Just link that into your heads. This is in my head. Fleming, that in 1963, just before he dies, goes to meet Simenon in France, and he's a great admirer of Georges Simenon. Simenon's never read a single Fleming, but Fleming's read every Simenon. And Fleming tells Simenon that, where do you get your ideas for characters? And I don't know what Simenon's answer is, but Fleming says, I get mine driving through France from shop fronts. I thought that was really an interesting thing. Then I discover in Fleming's book, Thrilling Cities, where he goes around the world, in Monte Carlo, he notices that the cry of the croupier is Le Carré for Baccarat. I thought, that's really interesting, Le Carré. And then, because David Cornwell would talk about how he would go to Monte Carlo with Ronnie, his terrible father, and he'd watch Ronnie gamble away the non-existent family fortune. I mean, this is quite an important part of David's childhood. So I thought, yeah, so that's interesting. Le Carré is a croupier's call. And then thinking Le Chiffre, Le Carré, the shop front, all this stuff about French. So I contact David. I say, is it possible that, you know, all this is percolated in your head subconsciously, and that's how you came up with Le Carré? No answer. He's died. so it reached him on the day of his death, my question. So I have no answer, but it's a bit like, it's quite speculative. But so innocent, no, in answer to your question, they never knew each other. And, you know, I think Le Carré is a great writer, and I think Fleming has created a great character.
Glenn.
Yes, your stories about Kennedy are just incredible. And I think you mentioned Alan Dulles. Was Dulles a fan? Did Dulles seek him out? And were there other big people in the CIA like Angleton that knew Fleming?
Angleton knew Fleming, and they talked about Dundee. I think they both had Dundee kind of, for some reason in my head, whenever they talked about Dundee, Angleton says Fleming became alive, because that's where his grandfather had come from, the Fleming. But with Dulles became... Well, Fleming knew Philby in the 30s because Philby was a great friend of Alaric Jacobs, who was at Reuters with Fleming. And in Jacobs' diaries, which I got hold of, there's lots of recording of, you know, Fleming and Philby are going to the swimming pool in Berkeley Square or whatever. And there's one operation, Fleming in 63, I think, is going to Beirut. In 1960, ostensibly on his way to write a book about Kuwait. But he tells the head of Naval Intelligence, I'm going to be in Beirut and I'll see if I can see what you wanted me to see. And it's all a bit coded, but it's clear that he's probably going to see Nick Elliott and possibly to find out about Philby there. And he calls Philby, in Goldfinger, I think he alludes to a Miss Philby, who's the secretary of the Bank of England women's volleyball team. So I think he makes kind of reference to that. But no, Dulles was a Bond fan from early on, and I think Jackie Kennedy introduced him to Bond. And just before the meeting with Kennedy, Dulles in London had always wanted to meet Kennedy, and Admiral Denning gets them to meet. And at this dinner, they get on like a house on fire, but they do talk about gadgets. And Dulles is obsessed with gadgets. And I think the CIA try out one of the Bond gadgets, which we now all have in our cars, the kind of GPS thing. But do you remember in Goldfinger, I think they attach something to the car. Anyway, Dulles experiments with one or two of these Bond devices. And then the Russians get hold of that and say that Dulles is, you know, best friend of Fleming and everything.
And Churchill as well?
Churchill preferred the brother, Peter Fleming. And so there's a meeting on board ship in 1946, the year Churchill's coming back from having talked about the special relationship in America, and Fleming's on board, and he comes into the cabin with Churchill and tells him he's just seen this plot of land in Jamaica, and he wants to live in Jamaica after the war, and Churchill just kind of wishes it was his brother Peter who was in the cabin. But what happened, Churchill was a great friend of Fleming's father, and writes the obituary of Fleming's father in 1917 for the Times. And both Peter, Andy, and Fleming asked Churchill for signed copies of this obituary, and Ian Fleming has it by his bed for the rest of his life, this Churchill obituary of his father. And he brings it into Bond. When Bond dies, so supposedly, the obituary in, I think, the last book is modeled on Churchill's obituary of Fleming's father.
Okay, one more final question.
I was wondering if Fleming was aware of the low success rate of the British intelligence operations.
Could you expand? Were they low?
Of being infiltrated at the highest level.
Oh, yes, yes. Sorry.
Nothing working.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, I mean, that's a very good question, because I think one of the reasons he writes Casino Royale in 1952 is our intelligence service has been infiltrated. Philby we don't know about yet, but we know about Burgess, who was at Eton with Fleming in 1924. So they would have sat opposite each other in chapel. You'd have known him. When Burgess is photographed in Moscow later, he's wearing his old Etonian tie, okay? I mean, and he has photographs of Eton and his mother on the steps of Eton in his Moscow apartment. Philby keeps his Westminster scarf in Moscow. In fact, I went back to Moscow in 2014 with Ben McIntyre, and they put the Union Jack on Philby's grave. So what happens is, and it's rather difficult for us to recapture this, and maybe we don't do it for obvious reasons, but so in 1951, when Burgess and Maclean defect, we don't know if they've defected. Fleming is at a dinner party given by Michael and Pamela Berry. Michael Berry owns the Daily Telegraph. He was at Eton with Burgess, and Burgess tried to get into pop with Michael's endorsement, but didn't. But Burgess now wants a job as a diplomatic correspondent, can you imagine, of the Daily Telegraph. And so he's invited to dinner, and there at dinner is Anthony Blunt, Ian and Anne Rothermere, and one or two, Alan Price-Jones, and they're waiting for the sixth or seventh, and it's Burgess. And Anthony Blunt says, I think if he's not come now, he won't come. Anthony Blunt is saying that because he spent the afternoon packing up Burgess's flat off Bond Street, knowing that Burgess had left for St. Malo 5 days earlier. So this is just an indication of how tight this community, they're all at school together, and these two defect. It has an absolutely seismic effect on British intelligence, because this small band of people suddenly in the inner sanctum are betraying each other. They don't yet have confirmation that they've defected. They don't know where they've gone. I mean, 15,000 policemen throughout the world are looking for them. They're seen in drag in Argentina, these reports. I mean, wonderful stories of the missing diplomats. And I think it's in that context that Fleming wants to rescue British intelligence. And so he writes Casino Royale as a kind of, that's one of the ingredients to bring back the luster of British intelligence. So it is an important stimulant, yes.
Thank you, Nicholas. This has been delightful.